Chapter 22. Elizabeth was on her way to London, accompanied by Jane and Mr. Darcy. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she fidgeted impatiently and stared out the window of the carriage. The past 2 days had been emotional, to say the least. After confessing her love for Mr. Bingley, she asked Mr. Darcy to take her to his home in London so she could finally tell him the truth. Before she left, she said goodbye to Mr. Wickham, who was leaving for Derbyshire, where he would attend law school. It was a particularly painful farewell. He had become her closest friend and confidant, apart from her sister. In many ways, he was even closer, as Elizabeth had been able to tell him things she had to keep hidden from Jane. She met him in Meryton for the last time at the pub, where they toasted their friendship. Before he climbed into the carriage, Mr. Wickham wrapped his arms around her and pulled her tightly against his strong chest. Elizabeth held him close, knowing it was extremely likely she would never see him again. Even if she woke up from her coma and managed to reconnect with Brian, they would be starting their friendship from the beginning. The thought caused two large teardrops to fall onto his shoulder. When she finally released him, Elizabeth saw tears in his own eyes and wondered if he too knew it would be the last time he ever saw her. "I wish you all of the happiness this world can offer, Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice trembling. "You deserve it more than anyone I have ever met. May God bless you." Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you for everything, Brian." Her eyes widened with embarrassment. "I mean, George," she corrected and rubbed a tear away from his cheek with her thumb. "I feel the same way about you. She paused, looking down at the ground. "I know," he whispered softly in her ear. Mr. Wickham hugged her one more time, then bowed deeply. Placing one foot on the step of the carriage, he threw one last smile over his shoulder at her. Then, with a wink, he climbed inside and rode away down the dirt road. Thinking of their parting made Elizabeth's eyes water once more as she stared out at the city from the window of the carriage. Jane gave her a sympathetic look. "Do not fret, Lizzie," she said as she patted her hand. "We will find Mr. Bingley." "What?" Elizabeth turned her head as she broke from her reverie. "Oh, right. She tried to smile. "Yes, I certainly hope so." At long last they arrived at the address Mr. Darcy gave the coachman for Mr. Bingley's home in London. They stepped out into the crowded street. Elizabeth felt a sense of foreboding as she gazed up at the darkened windows, then walked up to the front steps and hesitated before knocking on the door. After a few moments it opened and Elizabeth found herself face to face with a butler. "Excuse me," she asked tentatively, "is Mr. Bingley at home?" "I am sorry, miss," he replied. "Mr. Bingley has given up this house entirely. There is no one left except the servants to prepare it for vacancy." Elizabeth staggered backward down one step. "He didn't live there anymore?" "Do you happen to know where he went?" "No, miss. I am deeply sorry. He gave no forwarding address." "Thank you." Elizabeth turned and walked back down the steps toward Jane and Mr. Darcy, who were waiting by the carriage. "He's gone." "What?" Jane asked, her eyes narrowed. "Did they say where he had gone?" "No," Elizabeth answered in a hollow voice. Jane looked at Mr. Darcy. His face was set, his eyebrows knit in deep thought. "I did not have an opportunity before he left Pemberley to discuss his plans, so I do not know where he might have gone. However, I do know the one person here in London who is most likely to possess that information." Moments later, they were on their way to the house in which Caroline Bingley was residing. Considering she did not know about Jane's engagement to Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth thought it best if they waited outside while she faced her arch enemy alone. She walked up the stone steps and knocked on the door with a sense of dread at having to speak to Caroline at all. She reassured herself that if she knew where Mr. Bingley was, it would be well worth the 15 minutes of misery. When the butler answered the door, Elizabeth asked if she could speak to the mistress of the house. He gave her a look that suggested she was greatly inconveniencing him, and asked her to wait inside the door. She followed him into the entryway and watched him disappear down the hall, then took a moment to study the decor in Caroline's foyer. She smirked with satisfaction that it was as gaudy and presumptuous as she was. With a double take, Elizabeth noticed the same self-portrait that was hung at Pemberley had now been given its own place of honor on the wall, and wondered if it had ever been there at all, or if it were only her imagination. The butler came back before she could decide, and he gestured for her to follow him. As they entered the drawing room, Elizabeth saw Caroline sitting primly in a tall armchair with a cup of tea in one hand and a stack of envelopes in the other, and felt her stomach tie itself in knots. The butler announced her presence, then turned and walked out of the door. It slammed shut behind him, causing Elizabeth to jump and turn around quickly. Gritting her teeth, she walked determinedly toward the chair that Caroline sat in, refusing to be intimidated by her smug smile. Besides, maybe Caroline was intimidated by her. She must have seen Georgiana's face. Perhaps she thought Elizabeth was unhinged enough to attack her as well. She delighted at the thought. Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth's eyes twitched. Caroline. Is there something I can do for you? She picked up a quill and scratched it across an envelope. Yes, there is, Elizabeth insisted. Could you please tell me where your brother is? Caroline paused in her writing to glance up at Elizabeth. And why, pray tell, would I do that? Because I need to see him. His butler said he left his house here in London permanently. Do you know where he might have gone? Elizabeth continued, her jaw clenched. I have no idea where he is. I would never divulge his location to the likes of you, even if I did. Elizabeth pressed her lips together. Caroline, don't you ever get tired of being a bitch? Excuse me? Caroline cried, aghast. Here we go again. And my hand just stopped hurting, too. I just don't get why you would choose to spend your life being miserable. You make everyone around you miserable as well. No one likes you, Caroline. Literally, no one. In the 200 years since you were written into existence, because you are so unrelentingly hateful. Why don't you give being nice a try for once? You might like it. You have no idea what you speak of, Caroline replied coldly. No one has ever accomplished anything in life by being nice. Take my brother, for example. He was nothing but nice to you, and yet you reward him with a broken heart. Why on earth would I allow you to cause him further pain by informing you of his whereabouts? Elizabeth felt all the anger drain out of her as she dropped into the chair across from Caroline. Because I want to make it right, Caroline. I have to make it right. I didn't break his heart on purpose. I thought I was protecting someone else from being heartbroken. She exhaled. But I was completely mistaken. I can finally tell him how I really feel about him. Please, Caroline, I'm begging you. Tell me where he is. Tell me so I can tell him that I love him. Caroline considered her, with eyes full of what almost appeared to be compassion. Elizabeth's insides filled with hope. She's going to tell me. I was wrong. She isn't the devil after all. She watched Caroline open her mouth to speak, her lips curving upward into a genuine smile. Then her eyes grew cold and her sneer returned as she dropped her gaze back to her envelopes. You are too late. He will already have asked Georgiana to marry him by this time. He would be a fool to settle for anyone else, especially an unrefined, vulgar, indelicate trollop such as yourself. Elizabeth's nostrils flared as she watched Caroline contentedly scribbling away. What are you writing? I am addressing my engagement announcements. I wasn't aware that you had gotten engaged, Elizabeth remarked. Who's the unlucky fellow? Mr. Darcy, of course. Elizabeth bit her lip to hide her smirk. He, asked you to marry him, did he? Caroline looked up. Not yet. But it is only a matter of time, and I like to be proactive about such matters. I, unlike you, possess qualities that gentlemen like Mr. Darcy and my brother seek in a potential wife. Elizabeth smiled sweetly. Yes, I think you have made your opinion of me quite clear. She paused as she watched her continue to write. However, I, unlike you, possess the knowledge that Mr. Darcy has no intention of ever asking you to marry him. Caroline rose slowly from her chair, like a cat arching its back. The claws were finally coming out. Oh, really? And why might that be? Elizabeth took a mental snapshot of Caroline's face. Because he is already engaged. To my sister. Caroline laughed in a cackle reserved for only the most diabolical of villains. Mr. Darcy, engaged to your simpleton of a sister? I will never believe it. I could prove it to you if you like. Elizabeth stood to face her. They are both here with me. Right outside, in fact. I came here in Mr. Darcy's carriage. Caroline dropped her envelopes to the floor and hurried to the window that looked out onto the street. Elizabeth sashayed gleefully behind her. They both peered down to see Mr. Darcy and Jane standing awfully close together outside the carriage, smiling and talking. Then, with timing that could not have been more perfect, they leaned in for a quick but passionate kiss. Caroline gasped out loud. She turned, flabbergasted, toward Elizabeth, who was grinning back triumphantly. As it became immediately apparent Caroline would not regain the power of speech anytime soon, Elizabeth declared, Well, it looks like it's time for me to get going, Caroline. She placed one hand on her shoulder. If I don't see you again, I wish you every... Actually, no. I don't really give a damn whether you end up happy or not. So long, Caroline. She spun around and left the room without looking back. Where's the microphone when you need one? As soon as she stepped into the carriage, however, Elizabeth's victory seemed much less sweet. She was not any closer to finding Mr. Bingley than before, and now she had burnt down the already crumbling bridge with his sister. She told Jane and Mr. Darcy what happened and suggested they give up and return to Longbourn. They stayed in London for the evening at Mrs. Gardner's house and left early the next morning to give the horses time to recover. When they arrived back at the house, Mr. Darcy left to tend to what he referred to as business matters, with promises to return as soon as possible. Elizabeth and Jane went up to their room, where Elizabeth laid her head in Jane's lap and sobbed. Jane smoothed her hair away from her sister's forehead and attempted to comfort her with sentiments of hope. However, Elizabeth could tell from her tone that even Jane did not believe them. 2 full days passed by uneventfully. Elizabeth spent as much time alone as possible, usually outdoors. She occupied countless hours walking aimlessly through the fields near the house. Occasionally, she sat by a small pond, observing the family of ducks that inhabited it. She found herself envious of the simplicity of their life. Ducks don't have to worry about anything. They just keep swimming. The thought of swimming reminded her of the day at the lake, and Elizabeth succumbed to a fresh onslaught of tears. By late evening of the 3rd day after her unsuccessful trip to London, Elizabeth felt tranquil in body and spirit as she sat beneath the willow tree. She leaned against the rough bark, closing her eyes, and listened to the steady beating of her heart. How much longer would this last? How long could her heart go on beating without her being conscious? It seemed like a lifetime since the accident. What if someone made the choice to pull the plug and end it all? Maybe that wouldn't be so bad after all. She continued to listen to the unwavering thump, thump, thump that seemed to grow louder and louder in her ear. Confused, Elizabeth opened her eyes. That wasn't her heart. Something else was getting louder and louder. What was it? She strained to see in the semi-darkness of twilight. The fog that had rolled in from the drop in temperature made it difficult to distinguish anything beyond 15 feet in front of her. She rubbed the goosebumps that enveloped her arms and shivered in anticipation as she listened hard. Those were horse hooves. She was sure of it. As soon as she determined the source of the sound, it disappeared. It was now eerily silent. Elizabeth stood up quickly and gasped as a dark figure emerged from the fog and was walking slowly toward her. When she realized it was Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth's eyes grew round in astonishment. His eyes locked onto hers, and his mouth curved upward into a devastating smile. She smiled back at him, realizing that he reminded her of the final scene in the movie version of Pride and Prejudice. As her heart drummed inside her chest, Elizabeth knew without a shadow of a doubt this was infinitely better than any movie. Mr. Bingley stopped just before he reached her. "How did you know I would be here?" she asked breathlessly. He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. This is where it all began. She glanced around her at the canopy of feathery leaves that veiled them from the shadow of night and smiled. "Yes, it is." Mr. Bingley gazed longingly at her for a moment. "Miss Elizabeth, I did not get the chance to speak to you at Pemberley, though I desperately desired to." Elizabeth dropped her gaze to her feet. "Yes, I really am sorry about that." She glanced up at him from under her eyelashes. "What was it that you wanted to speak to me about?" He came closer, hesitating before taking her hands in his. "You are so cold," he exclaimed, then took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you." Elizabeth pulled the jacket tightly around her and breathed in deeply the scent of his skin still lingering on the collar. "Miss Elizabeth, a good friend of mine came to visit me yesterday. He said I should seek you out, that I should attempt just once more to profess how ardently I admire and love you. Those were his exact words. He believed your feelings may have changed since our departure from Netherfield, and he would not leave until I vowed to declare my love for you a second time, although I confess I did not require much convincing." Elizabeth felt her cheeks grow warmer. "He sounds like quite the guy, this friend of yours." "The greatest I have ever known." Elizabeth frowned. "But where did he find you? I went to your house in London, but they said you had left. Where did you go?" "Netherfield." "Netherfield?" Elizabeth echoed. "Why did you go back there?" "Well, you see," Mr. Bingley began, brushing a loose tendril of hair away from her face, "there is a girl who lives nearby, and though she has already refused me once, I'm afraid I am still mad for her." Elizabeth remembered Caroline telling her he was probably already engaged. "What about Georgiana?" "Miss Darcy? What about her?" "You didn't propose to her?" Elizabeth murmured, staring hard at the ground. Mr. Bingley put his index finger under her chin and gently lifted it. "Now, Miss Elizabeth," he admonished, "do you truly believe I could ever desire a mere mortal like Georgiana Darcy, when I am already madly in love with a goddess such as yourself?" "Well, she does have a pretty face," Elizabeth replied with a small shrug. "I mean, she did." She gave him a sullen look. Mr. Bingley then placed his hand on the side of her face and slowly ran his thumb across her lower lip. "Have I ever told you how much I love it when you pout like this?" he asked, staring covetously at her mouth. Elizabeth looked up at him. "You do?" "Oh, yes," he breathed, taking a step closer. "It makes me want to kiss you so badly." Elizabeth smiled. "Well," she began slowly, "then I suppose you probably should. Quickly. Before it goes away permanently." Mr. Bingley held her face gently with both hands as he kissed her, his lips warm and soft against hers. She felt shockwaves of pleasure course through her entire body as she melted into his arms. Then Elizabeth pulled her head back abruptly and squinted up at him. "Wait a minute," she questioned. Do I pout a lot? He leaned his forehead against hers and smiled with his eyes still closed. Not nearly enough, he whispered and pulled her closer. She wrapped her arms around his neck and nuzzled her nose against his, then smiled up at him. Mr. Bingley flashed his adorable crooked grin and kissed her again, gently at first, then more and more urgently, as though he had been starved for her love and didn't know it until that very moment. She sucked in his bottom lip, and he groaned softly, wrapping his arms around her and holding her securely against his body. As Elizabeth ran her fingers through his hair, she parted his lips with her tongue, and he pulled away for a moment, raising his eyebrows at her in surprise. She smiled and shrugged her shoulders. The French might be losing the war, but when it comes to kissing, they win, hands down. She gave a short laugh. Napoleon has to make up for his height somehow, right? Mr. Bingley's grin was roguish. And here I was, wondering if it was something you acquired from Darcy. Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. She could feel her cheeks blaze scarlet and opened her mouth to explain, but before she could say a word, he interrupted her with his lips. They continued kissing until the fireflies came out and lit up the night, surrounding them like their very own fireworks display. The sky was bright with stars. Elizabeth could just make out Venus shining brighter than the rest as she laid her head against Mr. Bingley's chest and sighed contentedly. He was sitting at the base of the tree with his arms around her waist, his fingers interwoven with hers. Though she wanted more than anything to simply be with him in that moment, there were still some unanswered questions in her mind. She lifted her head and asked, "How did you really know I would be here tonight?" Mr. Bingley smiled. "I had a suspicion." He gazed down at her skeptical eyes and laughed. "That is to say, a suspicion and a confirmation from Miss Bennet, after I went to Longbourn first. Not only did she blame herself entirely for the misunderstanding that caused you to refuse me, but she also informed me of the most likely place you might have gone to be alone." "It wasn't her fault. It was mine. It was all mine. If I hadn't been so blind to what was right in front of my face, I would have seen that it was Mr. Darcy Jane was in love with. And I also would have realized that I was in love with you from the first moment I saw you. Well, the first moment I saw you properly. Fainting sort of puts a damper on love at first sight. When I think of how much more time I could have spent with you." Elizabeth hung her head. As she felt his lips graze the nape of her neck, her mouth curved into a sly smile. "So, how long do you think it will take Jane to wake up and notice that I haven't returned? Perhaps she will think we have eloped." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows at him. "Not a bad idea, actually." She arched an eyebrow. "Although you haven't asked me to marry you yet." He gave her an indignant look and she blushed. Not tonight. Anyway. Grinning, Mr. Bingley brought his mouth down to her ear and whispered, "Miss Elizabeth Bennet, will you marry me?" She lifted her face to meet his. "Yes," she whispered back and kissed him. After a few moments of blissful silence, Elizabeth gazed down at his hands as they gently caressed hers. I have something to ask you now," she said quietly. "It's more of a favor, actually." "Your wish is my command, my darling." Elizabeth smiled. "Remember that day at the lake?" He bit his lip and closed his eyes. "A specific image comes to mind." "Yes." "Any chance of a repeat performance, you think?" "Will you be wearing men's breeches as knickers again?" Elizabeth smirked. "Of course. And maybe this time I will wear the wet shirt." She laughed at the unfocused look on his face. "Since you certainly won't be needing it." Mr. Bingley laughed and pulled his jacket over her shoulders. Elizabeth felt her eyelids grow heavy as she lay warm, happy, and safe in his arms. She gave in to her drowsiness and closed her eyes. Just before she fell asleep, she thought to herself that she could stay right here where she belonged forever.